And it is Truth Script Tuesday. Welcome. We have a number of articles to talk about today on the Truth Script website. And I've had a string of articles I've written. We were joking in the one of the chat groups for the editors of Truth Script that there's only so much of Jon Harris people can take. So there's only one this week, but I think in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, I've written like 4 articles for Truth Script, which is not normal for me. But we have 2 other articles as well. One by my brother. He was actually supposed to join me today and ended up having surgery instead, right? That wasn't expected. But he had appendicitis, and thankfully, though, he's home. He's doing well. It was actually a same-day thing. See, I had appendicitis when I was about 5 years old, and I was in the hospital for days. And so I thought this is going to be a major thing, but apparently not. I guess they were able to do it less invasively. And so he's not with us, all that to say, but we have an article from him on the border situation. So we're going to talk about that because you hear this a lot from evangelical, more progressive types who want to say that an open border or a vague notion of welcoming the alien and stranger, meaning softening border policies and immigration policies, is somehow part of Christian duty, which is just fascinating to me since there's so many other principles and laws in the Old Testament they would never touch with a 1,000-foot pole. But that's something that we are bound by, and I don't even think they quite understand or are representing it accurately. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in the article my brother wrote, and then there's another article not written by me called "The Bible and Human Rights." And human rights is, of course, something that you hear about a lot as well. So we're going to talk about all 3 of those topics on True Script Tuesday. As always, if you want to be connected to True Script, if you want updates when these articles come out, then sign up on the main page, truthscript.com. There's a Stay Connected tab. Just put your email address in there. We appreciate you signing up and, of course, sharing the articles from True Script. That is how we get the message out there. That's how we get, honestly, a message that's positive, that's bite-sized, that normal evangelicals in the pews can read, digest, understand. And in the sea of articles from other websites that, frankly, are trying to push the needle in a leftward direction, it's good to have an organization like TrueScript out there cranking out material that isn't doing that. And that's not our goal at all. So we have a library that we're forming of all kinds of articles on all kinds of different topics that are helpful and accessible. You can donate. It's a 501c3. Just scroll down to the bottom, and there's a donate tab. And then a publish tab if you want to publish with us. Of course, we do have our men's retreat coming up, Fundamentals Conference. You can go to fundamentalsconference.com and sign up there. I would highly recommend coming out. We always have a great time. Any questions, my email address is the contact email on fundamentalsconference.com. Well, let's get started here. And one more announcement. I almost forgot. So this is the first time I'm saying this, but we are starting another podcast through TruthScript. And I do have some details. I can't share all of them now. And some of them I don't have, but we are going to be starting another podcast in the next month. And it's, I will announce the name. We do have a name. I'm not going to put it out there quite yet. I will announce the name as we get closer, but it's going to be myself and Matthew Pearson. If you know Matthew Pearson, I've interviewed him for my other podcast, Conversations That Matter. He's a young guy. He's very smart, though, very sharp, very funny. And it's going to be a little more of a variety type podcast where we talk about articles on the TrueScript website, but we also tackle theological topics and topics in the news. So that's more to come. I'll just say that. More to come on that front, but something that we've been talking about for a few months now. And finally, we're going to be making it happen here very soon. So wanted to let you know about that. And also in the process of planning 2 different conferences for TrueScript. And if you could contact TrueScript or contact myself, you can go to Fundamentals Conference and my contact info is there. Info@TrueScript is probably the best place. But if you want to help us with something, we found a venue for 2025, doing a conference there, a smaller conference, but we're going to do one on church history, probably the American founding and church history. And so I will give you more details as we get closer. It will be on the East Coast. Sorry, Westerners. In Pennsylvania is where we're looking right now. But we are looking at doing a bigger conference in 2026. This is something that that could be major. Well, it will be. It will be a big conference. And we are looking for a venue in Tennessee, preferably in the Nashville area. And so, of course, hotels, but we want a venue, hopefully, that's cancel proof. And so if you're a church in that area, if you have access to a space in that area that can hold a big crowd of people, like I'm thinking like 1,000 people, and let me know, please. And or let TrueScript know, info@truescript.com, and someone will get back to you, and we can discuss costs and all that kind of thing. But that's something that we're looking at, and we would appreciate your help. So with all those announcements said, let's get into some of the articles from TrueScript for this past week. The first is called The Bible and Human Rights by Brooks Weaver. The Bible and Human Rights by Brooks Weaver. And he starts off with a question: how do we know that human rights, that humans have rights, I should say, and intrinsic value? That's a good question. We hear this talk all the time, don't we? Human rights. It's a violation of human rights. It's a violation of the laws of nation and the rules of warfare and the Geneva Convention, right? If you watch those World War II movies, right? It violates the Geneva Convention. Well, how do we know humans have rights? Where does that even come from? At a bare minimum, what are human rights? Simply put, human rights are exclusive rights afforded to a class of living beings deemed human, right? So first you got to answer what a human is, right? Biblical Christianity gives an answer as to why humans have rights. In the first chapter of Genesis, we are told that God made man in his image and gave him the privilege of wielding dominion over earth-dwelling creatures. And when he spoke to Noah, he reasserted man's dominion, adding the privilege of consuming animals in addition to plants. The motif of man's dominion over the rest of Earth's creatures appears again in one of David's Psalms. That's Psalm 8, verses 4 through 8. Let's just go there real quick, actually. It says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the work of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field and birds of the heavens and the fish of the seas, whatever passes along the paths of the seas." So here you see a hierarchy that God created, wove into creation itself. And this sets humans apart from angels and from animals. And Jesus reaffirms intrinsic human value and superiority in the Sermon on the Mount. So the Bible accounts for this, and Darwinism does not. I think that should be obvious, but the article goes on and argues that Darwinism can't account for this. We're just a conglomeration of atoms. There's nothing really special about us. You can't argue that you can argue that humans are more complex, but why should something that's more complex and perhaps bears more intelligence, why should that take precedence over other less complex or less intelligent beings? For example, you wouldn't go to a nursing home or a house where people with special needs live and say, well, you're less valuable because your cognitive abilities are less than they were at one time, or less than they would have been if you didn't have a certain condition. That's just ridiculous, right? But so we all know this, I think, but what accounts for it is the question. And of course, the Bible does. There's a lot here, and I don't have time to go through every single aspect of the article. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, to go to truescript.com and check it out. This is actually a good-sized article. Some of our articles are shorter. This one's a little bit longer than some of them. I think I have a habit of writing longer articles for TrueScript that probably go outside the boundaries, but I'm not the only one all the time. But he also critiques the pantheist, because the pantheist says all is God. And if all is God, then there's no distinctions really between anything. How can you make a distinction between man and a cow or a plant, which we all know intrinsically we need to do? So the final argument really here is that we need scripture. Suppose one wanted to appeal to a non-scriptural theism. How then would one demonstrate that humans possess special rights apart from scripture? You won't see the word human rights when opening up a human cadaver, how would one have an objective demonstration or explanation apart from the public word revelation that there is such a class of creatures? Posting some ambiguous God to account for human rights solves nothing without the philosophically consistent public word revelation that gives an explicit explanation for the intrinsic rights. And that is found in biblical Christianity. And even Bertrand Russell, the atheist scholar, said that the rights of man have their origins in Puritanism. I've never heard that quote. That's frankly fascinating to me. The foundation of the Puritan movement was Scripture, where and you'll know from history that the Anglicans to this day, they emphasize more the liturgy, whereas the Puritan tradition and those who have come from that tend to emphasize the preaching. And you'll see that in the Reformed evangelical world today. One of the reasons the Puritans, I think, are so respected is because that emphasis on the preaching of the word. And goes on, talks about this is more than just rights. Since only by special revelation can we objectively demonstrate man's intrinsic value and rights compared to other creatures who do not possess them, then we ought to follow this same source when it defines that these rights lists obligations for the protection of these rights. What are the just consequences of those who violate or deprive another's rights? The Christian is thus justified when he turns to Scripture to answer these questions. And the last paragraph here is entitled, or the last three paragraphs, Getting Off the Slippery Slope. Arguing in a religiously neutral fashion in the arena of politics and ethics can be less offensive since it challenges someone's peripheral beliefs, leaving their core convictions intact, attacking the fruit but not the roots. However, this path of least resistance spares the cancerous foundational principles, which has led society down the slippery slope. Since the gospel deals primarily with salvation of the soul and thus eternal matters, and politics deals primarily with the earthly, Christians should be most eager to share that the doctrine of the Imago Dei is the only account for human rights. This means explicitly detailing that God, in the second person of the Trinity, Jesus the Christ, took on a human nature, lived the perfect obedience to God's ethical prescriptions, and died the death given to those who don't merely break God's law, but commit severe human rights violations. All right, so this is a good article. When I hear the term human rights today, I think I generally am I hear it in a negative fashion. I'm going to be honest with you. I tend to hear it and think, man, the person who's probably talking about that is not coming from the same viewpoint that I'm coming from. And I think it's because human rights is a fairly modern concept, or the terminology is modern, I should say. And because of that, when we hear the word human rights, what we often think of are, in the context today, at least, LGBT inclusion, normalization, that kind of thing, labor relationships, or social arrangements that are viewed as oppressive today. And these are the things that are always the violation of human rights, right? Mostly the homosexual stuff, to be quite honest. Uganda's anti-homosexual policies violate human rights. That's what you hear. And I do think that this was created as a standard. At least the term is it is a replacement of really what Western societies viewed as fundamental, which it wasn't human rights. It was just the rights of men. It was, that sounds like the same thing, but it was based on a Christian foundation, that your rights, mediated through tradition and so forth, but fundamentally, ultimately, having a source in the divine. Your rights as a human, but really your rights as a person made in God's image, right? Which is exactly what Brooks Weaver's arguing here. But when the term human rights got popular and was used in organizations like the UN and other global NGOs and so forth, it seems to carry this idea of transcending religious disputes and understandings. And this is something that everyone can agree on. Everyone in the world can come together, and we agree on this human rights language. But I think the right question is being asked in this article: how in the world do you justify this? How in the world do you find a foundation that makes sense of humans being a distinct class that have responsibilities that they should be allowed to fulfill? And those that space there where they're allowed to fulfill it being a right that they have. So, good article from Brooks Weaver. And these are the kinds of things we want to push. We want to push back against a secular approach to the fundamental rights of individuals, or the responsibilities individuals are to have, because God is the one who's given those things, not some arbitrary whim, and it's not intrinsic to just humans because of something rooted in the biology of humans necessarily. It's something that is from a divine source. Well, the next article I wrote, so I can talk about this pretty. I don't need to read it to you. I'm just going to share my thoughts, and it's actually about the same. I was right. I do write longer articles. It's about the same length as the one by Brooks Weaver, but it's called "Why the Left Hates Horizon: An American Saga." So, this is an interesting movie. This just came out not long ago. It didn't do great at the box office, and my brother and I were going to talk about why that is. I can only guess at what he was probably going to say, but I think that it's long, for one thing. It's over 3 hours long, and it is complicated. There's a lot of characters. I think it moves at a good pace, but it's not a simple story, and it didn't have a fan base. Lord of the Rings is maybe comparable in the sense that it's also long, but there was a fan base. There's people who like the book. Same thing with Dune. This movie, and it's the beginning of a movie series, doesn't have that. It only has the screenplay, I believe, and there's no novel or anything connected to it. So people don't exactly know what they're getting into, and it might get confusing. It's not quite War and Peace level. If you've read the book War and Peace or watched the BBC documentary, you just start forgetting who the characters are because it's very difficult. It's not quite that bad, but there's a lot of characters. And I'll tell you what, I thoroughly enjoyed the movie in many ways, and I'll explain why. But the left didn't like it. The left did not like this movie. And the Daily Beast ran a review entitled "Kevin Costner's Horizon is a misogynistic, racist, retrograde mess." So tell me what you really think. It's some of the critics says it's confused about history. It's old. It's an old-fashioned Western. It's benefiting from genocide. The New York Times stated the parallelism between the way that an Indian atrocity happens and the way a white posse, essentially vigilantes, going after Indians, the way they behave. There's this parallelism that there's good and bad on both sides. And they say that suggests that both the settlers and Native Americans have blood on their hands. That's a reductive take at best, which lets everyone off the hook. So they didn't like Kevin Costner's view of history here. And I've explained on my podcast, on my Twitter feed, that actually at the RNC, when Trump closed his speech, he gave a version of history that you could call the sacrificial narrative, I suppose, where people came, settlers, explorers, pioneers, and they scaled the heights of mountains, and they suffered deprivation, and they went through so many things in order to bring to us the great place that we have today that we all enjoy. And this is a narrative that confers identity. It makes you proud to be an American. And I would say on the right, you still have this. On the left, and even some quarters now of the new right, you have something replacing it. You have an emancipation narrative where it's not about the great feats that people went to make America what it is. It's more the story of how we became more socially equal over time through people who were willing to challenge social arrangements. And so those people end up being the heroes, and the people who actually fought wars and crossed oceans, not so much. It's the people who are victims who become the heroes, and the people who help the victims in that story. So it's a different narrative. It has actually a different set of values in some ways and a different cast of characters. And Kevin Costner's movie Horizon, or the series of movies, is the sacrificial narrative. It's not the emancipation narrative. It's a sacrificial narrative. And I think that's why the left ultimately doesn't like it. And so I talk a little bit about the state of Westerns, spaghetti Westerns to Quentin Tarantino. Like, there's just a lot of violence. The West is this kind of Darwinian dog-eat-dog world. It's cruel place. There's really not any moral center. Even the good guys are bad guys. And this is different. There actually is a moral center. And the town of Horizon is personified in Sienna Miller's character, Frances Kittredge, and her daughter, Diamond. And they suffer the profound loss of their family, yet choose not to grow bitter or seek revenge. Instead, they showcase the kind of resourcefulness, kindness, and stubborn innocence that makes Horizon the place that it is. And so Horizon becomes this moral center, represented in female domestication in a way, that there's a place in the wilderness, and it's a beautiful wilderness, right? It's not just a Darwinian dog eat dog world. This is there's suffering that happens, there's hostility, but there's potential, and that's the point. That there's this place called Horizon. It's got potential, and that weaves the different stories that the movie presents together. Is that there's this interest in this place, and of course, the place though is a place where families thrive, and that's something that we're not used to seeing. In fact, some of the characters, I'm trying to remember when I've seen a character like this on film before. That one of the characters is a officer in the cavalry, and there's really no moral flaw that he has. It's just not the kind of heroes. It's very black and white, like the old westerns. There's not a lot of moral ambiguity in this. So there's a lot more that can be said. If you really want to know more, go and read the whole review, because and it's First Lieutenant Trent Gephardt is the character I was just referring to that doesn't have a moral flaw, played by Sam Worthington. But there's some boundaries, and this is the main point. There's some boundaries that are made in the movie. So you have a boundary between civilization and barbarism, and there's also a boundary between men and women. I was surprised there's actually a scene where, I mean, reading it, looking at it in the context of 2024, you'd have to see this scene where someone makes fun of girls as if they're guys, and it's taken as a great offense. And you're thinking, 2024? That seems almost like a knock on transgenderism. It's just interesting they kept that in there. And then there is an aura of providence in this. It's not just a world where every man has to fight for himself because no one else is going to do it, and there's no morality directing anything. There's actually some kind of a providence leading people toward this place called Horizon. So I really liked it for those reasons, but I did say, and I don't know how I phrased it, I'm looking for the exact place I said it. So I did say this. I said, there is a scene where for a brief second, the audience is exposed to a portion of a woman's bare breast. This is not meant to serve as a sensual purpose so much as expose the immorality of two peeping toms who have a run-in with a wagon master over it. Still, this is not something Christians want to be surprised by. There's also a handful of casual references to God or Jesus, despite the otherwise lack of profanity. And violence is why it has the R rating, though it's not gratuitous violence. So I have to let you know that there are some objectionable things in this, and if you use a program like VidAngel to edit scenes, I think this could be a great movie. But I would not show it to your family, and I can't put my recommendation behind it, but I can recommend, I think, what it's trying to do. And I think that's why the left didn't like it. And then, of course, we have, last but not least, this article, and this is Twisting Scripture to Justify an Invasion. Twisting Scripture to Justify an Invasion. Welcome the sojourner, love the stranger, for you are strangers in Egypt. Love your neighbor. Truly I say to you, as you did to one of the least of my brethren, you did to me. For decades, these Bible verses have been thrown into the face of even the most reticent Christians who would dare to advocate for strong and strict borders in their nations and across the Western world. And because they're supposed to welcome the foreigner, right? It's time that this particularly heinous form of scriptural butchery was addressed in specific detail. And so that's what the point of this article is. And boy, this is an article you need right now. You need articles like this because, boy, you're not going to get it from the Gospel Coalition. You're not going to get this from Christianity Today. You're not going to get this from Relevant Magazine. The major Christian organizations are going to be pushing the narrative, and they're not going to be examining it in biblical terms. So let's first talk about really the modern day horror story that's going on right now in many places in the West, called the migrant crisis, the refugee crisis. And, you know, those are the names that are often used, but leftist evangelicals like to just talk about the sojourners. They soften the language. And Christians need to not be ashamed to use the term invasion, because it's the most descriptive term of what's currently happening. And the terminology matters. So let's use the right words for what's happening. A massive human trafficking network market that starts in other nations but sees much business in the U.S. Recent estimates are over 1 million people in the U.S. Are currently entrapped in some sort of trafficking, slavery, usually forced sex work. That's part of this. Unfathomable amount of deadly drugs poured through our borders, arriving in every corner of the nation, causing World War II level death. Fentanyl, a drug with the potential to easily kill with only one use, now sits at only around $1 a pill. An endless amount of revenue for multinational drug cartels, solidifying their control over many regions and even entire nations. I mean, who are the governments? I mean, there are forces that seem almost more powerful than the government when you have these cartels that run between countries and control things. Economic strain on native born citizens because of the billions of dollars spent on migrants, the flooding of the job market, competition, a wave of preventable crime, rape, murder, drug use and trafficking, illegal squatting and sophisticated shoplifting networks, the collapse of social programs that native citizens have paid into their whole lives that are bankrupt now, the disastrous social effects of families being split up by migration. I mean, this is all happening. It's all happening. Many of you see it. It's your part of your everyday life. Call it what it is. I think that's the first step here. Don't just put this in the category of an abstract care for the poor or justice for the sojourner. Call it what it is. It's a catastrophic, tangled mass of violence, displacement, abuse, rape, death, and despair. This is actually a pretty brilliant line. My people are destroyed for an inability to think in categories. In Romans 13, Paul reminds the faithful in Rome the following. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is an authority? Then do what is good. You will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath to the wrongdoer. It's a bitter truth that Christians have been impaired only on a half application of that passage. Most familiar use of this application in recent times has been that churchgoers who are reminded incessantly of their Romans 13 duty to obey the government COVID-19 measures. Typical discussions surrounding the application of this passage concern how those in government authority should behave, as most of us aren't in a position of civil authority. But some of us are, and probably more should seek to be. In Romans 13, we are clearly presented with the baseline responsibility of the state to protect its people, not the people of other states, not an abstract concept of people, but living, breathing individual souls that make up a nation. The Greek word exousia, from which governing authorities is translated, signifies designated authority and jurisdiction, so a real tangible state or nation governing a real tangible people. These scriptural details are crucial because they provide a special category for a sphere of authority to which Paul identifies a Christian obligation to be subject or subordinate. So many subversively progressive Christian organizations and leaders capitalize on a general lack of biblical understanding and the way to think in categories to exploit Christian compassion. And they employ carefully chosen scriptural command stories and parables to shame Christians who want to enforce the law by deporting those who've broken it by entering their nations illegally. And so my brother, David, catalogs, I should say, some of this. So he talks about vague appeals to love, like love your neighbor as yourself. Such applications leave out any love for the neighbors living within your borders. Old Testament passages mentioning the sojourner, the Rhea, in Hebrew refers to another alien or even friend. Most of the time, the word is used in its passage to encouraging or commanding good treatment of outsiders living among the Hebrews. There are general principles of not mistreating outsiders that could be taken from these passages, but it's the height of absurdity to go from this basic application to welcoming the entire world. And in the Old Testament, if you were invaded, that was handled with military action, right? You wouldn't say, you have an invading army coming in. Well, let's welcome the sojourner, right? Like, you have to think in categories. Using Jesus' words or actions is another way. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me water. Again, the application is personal and specific and has nothing to do with importing millions of people. So, again, it's this personal jurisdiction thing that's now applied to broad policies, and it was never intended for that. Passages like Amos 5, let justice roll down. Again, these are so broad and general. There should be open borders because let justice roll down, right? We're supposed to be welcoming. The informed Christian doesn't need to be intimidated by the misuse of Scripture to justify the current mass illegal migration. Scripture is meant to be interpreted and applied in context, not to be bent to the whims of progressive political goals. The Christian who desires to see his nation's borders respected, the fruits of his labor secured, and the security of his family maintained, desires no evil thing. His desires are in keeping with the most basic biblical principles concerning civil duties. So this is the article, and I would suggest if you are concerned about this issue, share this. Go to truthscript.com, find Twisting Scripture to Justify an Invasion. Share this on your social media. It definitely helps us out. And I think it helps out the Christians who are confused on these issues. We need more materials like this. And I've been putting out a lot of video content to try to explain some of these things, but we need some short articles that pack a punch. And that's what TruthScript does. It delivers on that. So please consider giving to TruthScript if you have the means to do so, and consider sharing some of TruthScript's articles around to help people think through these important matters. Well, that's it for today. There's one question, I guess, in the chat. I should probably get to that. Ray says, I wonder if the Sojourner teachers welcome strangers to sleep in their homes. Well, that's a great point, Ray. Yeah, and I don't think so. They only apply it to policy, government policy, it seems like, not to personal life, which unfortunately for them, the biblical passages they try to twist are about personal life. And of course, the way that a church behaves, the way individuals behave are very different because they have a different function and purpose than the way the government ought to behave to protect the people that actually are within its borders. And so that's the podcast. But I appreciate everyone who has shared these articles around and everyone who supports TruthScript. It means a lot. And there's so many good developments happening right now at TruthScript. I'm excited to share more with you as time goes on. With that said, God bless and have a great evening.